Starting today, my sister will be living with us. It's all good news, so there's no reason to oppose it, right?
As soon as the move was finished, my husband strutted in, bringing his sister-in-law along. Indeed, as my husband said, my beloved grandfather had recently passed away. I was physically and emotionally drained from handling the funeral arrangements, sorting through his belongings, and most of all, the sudden loss of someone I loved dearly. The house where my grandfather lived, which I inherited as part of his estate, was where my husband suggested we move to. Just when I had finally finished moving in, my husband brought his sister-in-law without any discussion. A move so out of line that my love for him rapidly wilted. I'm Aurora. I graduated from the local university's pharmacy program and have been working as a pharmacist for 5 years. I met my husband, a fellow classmate, 2 years ago through a colleague at the hospital where I work. My husband, a full-time employee at a grocery store, has a generous nature. He had just broken up with a girlfriend from his student days and seemed heartbroken. I only had one boyfriend, once in high school, and it didn't last long. Neither of us had much experience in love, but somehow that felt reassuring. Our different jobs meant our days off rarely aligned, but we still managed a smooth relationship, and we got married when he was promoted to chief at his workplace. After our marriage, we rented an apartment in a convenient part of the city and started living together. My parents died in an accident, and since high school, I'd been living with my grandfather in his house. The house was very old, creaking with every step. But for the past 6 months, with his worsening illness and frequent hospital visits, it had been mostly empty. It was an important house for me too, filled with memories of my grandfather, and I still went back to clean it from time to time. Despite his exhaustion from the illness, my grandfather was overjoyed about my marriage.
I can keep fighting this tough treatment now.
I resolved to be truly happy, cherishing his words. Fortunately, I got along well with my husband's parents. They lived quite far away, so we might only meet a few times a year. "You're always welcome to visit," they had said. I had a promising start to a happy married life. But there was one thing that worried me: my sister-in-law. She's a lively 19-year-old in her first year of university. Living away from her family home, she attends a university near our apartment. My husband chose our place, partly because it was close to the university his sister attended. They'd always been close, and she had expressed a desire for us to move nearby. Of course, it's good to be close with family, but I regretted not discussing it more when my husband practically decided on our living arrangement based on his sister's whims. 3 days after the move, on a weekend when I planned to finally sort through the remaining boxes, my husband brought my sister-in-law over unannounced. Caught off guard in casual clothes and no makeup, I was flustered. I couldn't just send her away, so I hurriedly cleared some space and had her sit in the living room. I had met her a few times while we were dating, but always with prior arrangement, and only when we were out, so I had been properly dressed. If I'd known she was coming, I would have dressed up, I said irritably to my husband, but decided to calm down in front of my sister-in-law. "Congratulations on your marriage. Please take good care of my brother," my sister-in-law said, handing me a paper bag. Inside was baked goods from a famous bakery.
You didn't have to go to such trouble. If I try to return the favor, it'll cost me a fortune,
my husband said, peeking inside and laughing carelessly, but I was inwardly tense. As my husband said, my sister-in-law was quite a spendthrift. With her expensive clothes and accessories, she seemed too young for such luxury items. I had subtly asked my husband if she might be involved in something dubious, but he changed his expression instantly when it came to my sister-in-law.
She wouldn't do anything like that, but I'm worried, so I'll offer to help her out financially if she's struggling, he said.
My sister-in-law supposedly receiving a monthly allowance from her parents. I heard it from my mother-in-law herself, and she even told me how much, so I don't think it's a lie. Despite receiving enough money to live comfortably without any luxury, separate from tuition, my sister-in-law is currently also receiving an allowance from my husband. When I said it's all too indulgent, my husband argued back, and it turned into a heated argument. I could somewhat understand his concern for his sister, but I was also displeased, because there were times he'd send my sister-in-law expensive purses and accessories every month, and even go to her apartment to cook for her. But aside from that, he was a kind husband who willingly did household chores, so that was my only concern about him. The problem lies with my sister-in-law herself. My sister-in-law, it seems, doesn't think highly of me and acts condescending. I guess in her world, where her parents and brother dance to her tune, I must seem like an obstacle. Aurora, as a wife type, was unexpected. My brother used to date mostly beautiful women like models. Aurora, you are, how should I say, more plain. There's a difference between who you date and who you marry, right? Hope he doesn't cheat on you. Aurora, you're a pharmacist, right? So you must earn a good salary. Why don't you dress more fashionably? You were such a nerdy student, only good at studying, weren't you? She whispers these endless snide remarks when my husband isn't around. She's essentially a 19-year-old kid, and it's exhausting to deal with her seriously. There were times I thought about telling my husband, especially when she was persistent. But he dotes on my sister-in-law and could easily imagine it would only lead to more trouble. Since her harassment was limited to mean comments, I decided to keep it to myself and not tell anyone. Besides, we're in for a long relationship, and trying to get along in a hurry would only backfire, so I thought it'd be better to gradually deepen our relationship without taking it too seriously. Just a few days ago, my sister-in-law, who I'd met recently, came over again without notice. But at that time, my husband hadn't returned home yet, and I was preparing for my afternoon shift. The cafeteria was crowded, so I thought I'd come over for lunch. I brought some friends too, is that okay? Suppressing the urge to shout at her unreasonable behavior, I managed to send her and her classmates, who were standing beside her, home while keeping my composure. I don't know how she narrated the incident, but during my evening shift, I received several calls from my husband.
Turning away hungry kids? Are you out of your mind? If you were busy, you could have at least given them some money. My sister called to say she was embarrassed in front of her friends.
I don't know if this was the trigger, but I started noticing a change in my husband's attitude around this time. The household chores, which we had agreed to share since we both work, gradually stopped being done by him, and as I couldn't stand things being left for days, I ended up doing everything, and it became solely my burden. His easygoing nature, which I had admired, turned out to be just sloppiness. His newly acquired hobbies would quickly be abandoned and gather dust, which was a common occurrence. When his hobby stuff started cluttering not only his room, but also the dining table and car, I had to speak up. But he just ignored it and didn't deal with it. I feel like even his interest in me is fading because I'm always nagging. He's so neglectful, but when it comes to my sister-in-law, it's different. My sister-in-law's unannounced visits continued, and she would eat our food and torment me without any pretense. Initially, she did this behind my husband's back, but recently, knowing he's on her side, she openly makes snide remarks. She criticizes the food I make. This seasoning is too strong. Are you really a pharmacist? Are you deliberately making people sick with weird food so they'll buy your drugs? Bro, you better watch out. She would make these terrible jokes, insulting even my profession, and my husband would just laugh along. And every time she would wheedle a considerable amount of money from him, not just pocket change. I'm running low on living expenses. Or, I want to buy textbooks for college. I can understand, but I want to buy a birthday present for a friend. Now that's just her own convenience. Moreover, she drags my husband along for shopping and makes him buy expensive brand items. When I point this out, of course, it's my right to spend my own money. He snaps back, making any conversation futile. My husband, unaware, doesn't see my sister-in-law laughing at me, getting everything she asks for while his wife gets nothing. Whenever I try to address anything with my sister-in-law, she immediately turns on the waterworks and melodramatically seeks my husband's help. His falling for such poor acting is beyond saving. I realize too late that my husband has an extreme fondness for his sister. His belief in everything my sister-in-law says and lecturing me is laughably pathetic and enough to kill any affection. But my sister-in-law, now in her third year, will soon be busy with job hunting and senior paper writing, so I decided to endure it a little longer. I hoped that after graduating, she'd quickly get married and her mean streak would calm down somewhat. Yet, what hit me hardest wasn't my husband or my sister-in-law, but the death of my beloved grandfather. With no grandparents or parents left, I inherited his estate. I thought about demolishing the house, which held beautiful memories, but my husband stopped me.
We should live in this magnificent house as a couple,
he suggested. My grandfather, who had a long hospital stay in his later years, hardly knew my husband. His desire to keep this house was unexpected, and I was overjoyed at that moment. My grandfather was gone, but I could return to this house. The bubble burst just a few months later. During a pre-move inspection, we found that only the plumbing needed repairs. My grandfather cherished this house he built in his youth, and the contractor even commented on its good condition for its age.
The creaking floors bothered me, but I thought we could remodel when we started a family. I cleaned the rooms in between work and sorted my grandfather's belongings. Once everything was packed and ready, I proceeded with the movers, thinking my husband had stepped out to the nearby grocery store when he disappeared without a word. I was surprised when he didn't return by departure time and responded curtly to my frantic calls to go ahead without him. Confused but not wanting to delay the movers, I headed to my grandfather's house first. I finally saw my husband after all the moving and paperwork are done, standing beside my sister-in-law. An uneasy feeling hit me right away, and it proved right when my husband dropped a bombshell. From today, it's the three of us living here. The house is big, and Aurora, you'd be lonely with just the two of us, right? It's cruel to have my sister live in a small apartment every month, and this is perfect timing. Aurora, you'll support her job search, won't you? What? Why would you decide that on your own? This is my grandfather's house. You should have consulted me first. It wouldn't matter if I did, right? The house will be livelier, and my sister can focus on her studies and job hunting. What's the problem? To be clear, it is a problem. We'll talk about this in detail later. So can you leave for today? I was exhausted from handling the funeral and moving preparations alone for months. I had no mental energy to speak to someone who casually mentioned living in this house after my grandfather's death as good timing. But my husband just yelled, not caring at all. What right do you have to say that? If you don't like living together, then you can leave. I proposed this thinking it was a good idea, and now you're talking down to me. I'd feel refreshed if you were gone. I won't tolerate anyone who treats my precious family badly. I was shocked by his words, as if he didn't consider me family at all. But I decided there was no need to seriously engage with such ridiculous people, and chose to stay calm. So what? Are you saying I should leave? Meaning we should divorce? I just want to confirm, so you can't claim you were tricked later. This house is mine by inheritance. The rights to this house are... Since we're divorcing, it'll come to a distribution of property, right? The house is a substantial inheritance. Are you saying just because your grandpa owned it, it's all yours? Look, the world doesn't revolve around you. I'm a rightful ex-husband, so I have a claim to half. I'll pay you for your half, so just leave. What my husband interrupted to say was utterly nonsensical. Aurora, you're always so stingy with money. You earn well yourself, but always want too much. You should be kinder to someone younger, you know, Auntie. You might think of me as a frivolous young girl, but girls need money. On the contrary, you always dress so plainly. Wear heavy makeup. What do you even spend your money on? You've completely given up being a woman. It's pathetic. My sister-in-law, having completely won my husband over, joined him in accusing me. Seeing this, I completely lost any affection for them both, and just wanted to leave as soon as possible. So I told them I would go. The rights to the house are no longer an issue, but are you sure? I want to confirm properly. The siblings seemed briefly puzzled by how easily things were resolved, but then they began smirking again. Trying to unsettle us was so obvious. Such a sore loser. Well, I appreciate that you agreed to divorce. Here, sign this and leave. My husband threw the pre-filled divorce papers at me. I was so fed up that I was relieved it was happening quickly. Talk about sour grapes. Sorry, I'm more loved than you, Aurora. When you remarry, maybe try being a bit more feminine. They laughed together, so I sighed heavily and picked up the divorce papers. Hearing that, my sister-in-law started to confront me again, so I turned to my husband. You're so clueless, poor thing. Your wicked sister plans to kick you out soon, too. Instead of laughing, why don't you two have a proper fight? What? What are you talking about? My husband looked utterly foolish, still tilting his head. But my sister-in-law, perhaps due to her youth, couldn't keep a poker face and looked frozen. She seemed to come to her senses when my husband called her name. What are you saying, old lady? I would never do such a thing. But my sister-in-law's obvious panic seemed to unsettle my husband. Thinking I could turn the tables here, I forgot my tiredness and kindly explained. I overheard it by chance at a bar right in front of the university. You were too obsessed with your sister to come home, and I was too tired from all the paperwork and procedures to cook. I went out to eat with a friend to refresh. I took up my cell phone and played a recorded conversation. Since my brother's wife's grandpa passed away, I'll soon get that house. She is honestly annoying, but my brother is on my side. He does anything I say. It's funny, right? After I helped him when he was bullied by a guy friend of mine, he's been like that ever since. Well, he's got money, so I plan to use him well and take the house. No rent, lots of rooms, it's perfect. I want to live there together, so once I get the house, I'll just extract money from him and kick him out. Probably no problem. I think the old lady will get desperate if my brother mentions the house as a condition for divorce. Fortunately, I was seated nearby, so despite the noisy restaurant, the recording was clear. Initially, I started recording out of curiosity when they began bad-mouthing not just me, but also my husband. However, as they got drunker and more excited, they began discussing the worst plans, and that's when I unexpectedly caught them red-handed. I decided not to tell my husband about this immediately, waiting to see what he would do. Sadly, he fell for my sister-in-law's manipulation and presented me with divorce, which I agreed to. I had confirmed that my sister-in-law was at that table when I went to the restroom and returned. My husband stared at my sister-in-law with a shaking voice and a pale face. My sister-in-law, after looking down for a while, suddenly raised her face, red with anger, and protested.
This is fabrication. It's too convenient to be in the same restaurant. You don't even know my boyfriend, and it's creepy to assume based on seeing someone who looks a bit like him. And even if this really is me, it's crazy to spy on me like this. Stop playing detective and dragging people into it.
Seeing she still had some fight left, I resumed playing the rest of the recording. The sound of boots clattering towards the restroom, seemingly from a drunk person. Then a man's voice on the phone, talking to a woman in a cloying tone. He referred to my sister-in-law as an ATM, saying she would get him a house from the ATM's family. The man bragged about my sister-in-law gifting him whatever he asked for and giving him money since she wasn't working. My sister-in-law had been funneling the branded gifts she received from my husband to this boyfriend, along with money from her part-time job. Initially, I felt sorry for my sister-in-law being played, but now the situation was different. She was scheming behind my back, planning to involve my grandfather's house, so she deserved what was coming. After the playback, my sister-in-law was in a daze with no energy left to claim mistaken identity, confirming for my husband that she was indeed the woman talking with the man. Having said all I needed, I was about to leave when my husband grabbed my hand from behind.
Wait, you see now, right, Aurora? I was just being deceived. Let's cancel the divorce and live together as promised.
What? No need to cancel. I want the divorce too. Besides, your dear sister is crying. Take care of her until the end. I smiled brightly at my husband, feeling liberated, and quickly left with my minimal belongings. I filed the divorce papers and the divorce was finalized. I wanted to enjoy a relaxed single life, but things weren't that simple. My ex-husband was squatting in my grandfather's house, refusing to leave. Not wanting to interact, I had a lawyer explain that the estate wasn't subject to distribution of property.
So what does distribution of property mean then? No rights for the husband?
But he was unaccepting. I consulted my in-laws, who I'd been in regular contact with. They came over like a whirlwind, confronting my ex-husband and my sister-in-law in both my grandfather's house and my sister-in-law's apartment, scolding them thoroughly. My father-in-law is apparently quite intimidating when angry, and my mother-in-law later told me with a laugh how the siblings were shaking. I began to understand why my ex-husband was reluctant to visit his parents' house. The in-laws apologized deeply for the divorce, but I explained it wasn't their fault, and I wasn't holding any grudges. I changed my phone number and email address, asking my mother-in-law not to share them with my ex-husband. I think my ex-husband was desperate for the inheritance because he probably had no savings. When we got married, I suggested opening a new bank account for joint savings, but he refused. He couldn't save due to student loans, cell phone bills, hobbies, and giving large sums to my sister-in-law. So we decided to save separately. I had investments, so I didn't have much cash on hand and couldn't give him any money anyway. Through the lawyer, I told him there would be no distribution of property in exchange for not claiming the divorce bond. Since he signed the papers under my father-in-law's pressure, I intend to enforce it strictly. Eventually, my ex-husband and my sister-in-law, who had been wasting my money, were taken back to their parents' house. My ex-husband quit his job, and my sister-in-law left the school to work as a junior employee in a relative's company. They're being reformed through hard physical work and cry every day. My mother-in-law sent me a picture of my ex-husband with a slimmed-down figure from the labor, but I felt no thrill. My sister-in-law tried to charm her superiors with her youth and beauty, but being a relative of the boss, she got no attention. Her long, shiny nails were gone, and she was now doing a wonderful job digging in the dirt. Meanwhile, I'm enjoying peaceful days in my nature-filled grandfather's house. Though I miss him, looking through the organized albums brings me back to those times. I'm thinking of inviting dear friends over for parties in this warm home, watched over by my grandfather.